Good evening, welcome. We're now past the summer solstice, so it should start to, well, the sun should start to stop overstaying its welcome, but at least it's not raining tonight, I hope. If you hear anything, it is actually a cat on the roof, but eventually she'll get bored and bugger off. So yes, I have a comment straight away from Rachel saying it should be cracking tonight. So much has happened in the past week. This is the problem, really. Because, like I say, I try and start these things on one topic to begin with, because obviously there'll be lots of questions, and rather than go all over the place, because some people will be watching this non-live and they don't necessarily want. I like there to be a particular topic we discuss at the start, and it's like, well, what? It's how the strikes are going. The fact that I couldn't believe this. So Tory MPs, right? They seem to be in complete meltdown. I saw a report today that a WhatsApp group for Tory MPs is going into meltdown because they were genuinely surprised they lost Tiverton and Honiton. Now, granted, I'm not suggesting that people should have been completely confident that the Lib Dems would take it, but all the signs were that they would. So it seems odd to me that a lot of Tory MPs are genuinely surprised that they lost that seat, as in astounded. You know, they're completely rethinking their whole strategy. They're completely rethinking everything. It's absolutely baffling, because it shows to me that they're completely out of touch, that they don't understand what's going on. If they cannot, I don't even know. And I know a lot of them do appear to be a bit dim, but this is something else. But anyway, good in the UK, not so good in the US. It's not good in the UK. We just happen to have some good news. The US is an interesting one. Now, I tend not to discuss I discuss American politics all the time, but I tend not to do like videos on American politics unless there's a big crossover. Occasionally there is. I will be doing at least one in the next week about the overturning of Roe, effectively by the US Supreme Court. Not just because it's a big story, but because there is some interesting little context to throw into it. I don't normally, and I'm not going to sort of discuss that one tonight, because there will be limited amounts that I can say about it, being US politics, with a lot of things that I still need to research, but I will be doing a video on it. More in terms of what Biden could do about it if he wanted to, because he has options. But anyway, was the vote for the independent candidate in Wakefield a sign of Tory failure, or that Labour is still not cutting through the electorate in the red wall? It's sort of a bit of both. So yeah, there was an independent candidate that took quite a few votes, you would presume, off the Conservatives, because it was a former Conservative politician who's clearly no longer in the Conservative Party. It has to be said, Labour are not firing the imagination of the public at the moment. Now, it's the difficulty is in knowing exactly why this. There's any number of reasons why it might be, and it may well be a combination of several things. I'm hoping a big factor is the fact that Labour are not right now saying what they would do better, because at the moment it's really clear Labour are pointing out just how the Conservatives are failing. They're not very often saying what they would do instead. Now, a couple of thoughts about that. First of all, come the general election, that will not be the case, because they'll have a full manifesto of election promises, and they could be ready to go with it straight away. So even though they're gearing up for like next year or the year after, if there were a sudden general election this year, they could be ready to go, and then they could explain, you know, this is what we would do instead. And I understand the fact that their caution in wanting to do that now, because if they make a manifesto promise now, before there's the manifesto, in 2 years' time it may not be such a sensible move after all. But I do think that what they could do is to say, this is why the Tories are failing us right now. This is what they're getting wrong. And for them to say, if we were in power right now, and always emphasize the right now, if we were in power right now, we would do this. That way they're not making a policy promise for the future. They're just saying what they would do to react to the here and now. I do think they should do that. But at the same time, if that is a major issue, it's an issue that doesn't go away completely with the general election, but at least they will have policies. The question will then be, can they communicate them effectively? Because that is a big question as well. But anyway. If your MP Mark Jenkinson has anything to go by, they aren't the brightest. Well, I mean, a lot of it, and you get this in both parties. Well, you get it in all parties, but I mean, in terms of the big two, it doesn't help a large political party to have too many bright MPs. It's not a very pleasant way of looking at it. The problem is that for both Labour and the Conservatives, that they represent, the SNP as well in its own way, these are parties that represent a wide spread of political views. They're united around a particular common cause, but they're really a collection of different political tribes. And the reason why they band together is for some common purpose. So you don't want them too clever, because they'll constantly be politicians scheme, different factions within a political party scheme. You don't want them to be too good at it. So it is helpful for a political party to have a lot of not very clever MPs who will just toe the party line, vote the way they tell them to, say what they're told to say, and all the rest of it. You obviously need some bright ones, because you need some leaders. You need some people to run your campaigns. That includes election campaigns. You need people, if you find yourself in government, which is the aim for all of those parties, it's to make sure that you can deliver so that you can get elected next time, apart from anything else. But yeah, it's helpful for a broad church, as they describe it, a political party of lots of different factions, for a lot of them not to be all that bright. Right, okay, Tushan, this will be the only thing I mention about the row thing, because I'm not likely to cover it in any detail in my video, because I don't know if it's feasible. It says, should President Biden offer preemptive pardon to anybody accused of getting or performing an abortion made illegal by the US Supreme Court's ruling? Arguably no, because it would be a politically very dodgy move, but also it's a very limited move, because it doesn't solve the problem. There are options he has which might solve the problem, because that's the thing. You've got a problem now in America. What the Democrats need to do is focus on solutions, and there are possible solutions. And there's historical precedent for it. I haven't just watched someone who sounds like they know what they're doing. There's historical precedent for times in the past when something needed to, where the government was completely at odds with the Supreme Court, basically, and the government won. So there are options. I'm not sure that this is one of them, because it doesn't solve the problem. It's a sticking plaster. If Biden is replaced by the orange one again, disappears completely. It's not something to be relied upon, basically. You know, it's not something to be relied upon. And I don't think abortion clinics would restart up again, the ones who've already closed in various states, because of this, because they wouldn't bank on it. But anyway, I will leave that one there. Do I find it amusing all the Tory MPs that argue for first past the post now getting upset about voters using that system to their advantage? Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know that I would describe it as using the system to their advantage, because it involves Liberal Democrat supporters voting Labour, Labour supporters voting Liberal Democrat, Green Party supporters voting for anyone other than their own party. You know, it's not an advantage to do that. That what they're doing is making the best of a bad situation. But yeah, of course, the Conservatives are utterly horrified that it's been used against them. But in most cases, it will be used against them. You know, the Daily Mail complained today. I did a video today. Was it today? Yes. Their complaints about it are purely hypocritical. They have called for tactical voting. They called for an electoral pact in 2019, which they got from the Brexit Party with the Conservatives. They called for tactical voting in 2019 to help the Conservatives win a majority so that they could deliver their Brexit. So they have talked up tactical voting and electoral pacts when it suited them. So we can readily dismiss what the Daily Mail say on this issue. And quite frankly, I'm quite pleased about it, because I don't mind them reporting on tactical voting, because it lets people know that it's a thing. I can imagine there's an awful lot of people that don't really even think of voting tactically. I know there are some people who refuse to vote tactically because it's like, oh no, I don't trust the Lib Dems or the Greens or SNP or whatever. But there'll only be so many of those people. Those people are a relatively small number of voters. As we saw in Tiverton and Honiton and Wakefield. You take Tiverton and Honiton, Labour didn't even get their deposit back. They got just under 20% of the vote in 2019. They got less than 4% of the vote on Thursday. Why? Because the vast majority of the people who voted in 2019 switched their vote, or didn't vote at all, might have been, but by and large you would think switched their vote. That 4% was that hardcore, that core that will not bring themselves to vote. They knew what was going on. The media was all over it. It'll have been discussed in their households and so on. Everyone knew what was happening in Tiverton and Honiton. You voted Lib Dem if you want to get rid of the Tories. 4% of the people who voted still voted for Labour, knowing that. That's the hardcore that will not vote Lib Dem. You could remove the candidate even, they just wouldn't vote at all. That's what they are. Right, let's have a look some more on these comments, because I used to work with someone who became an MP. That was the same as the new Wakefield MP. They were as thick as mints. All right. There the similarity may end. I remember them trying to persuade me of their ideology prior to election. Hopeless. I mean, this is the thing. Obviously, I would always say it's a very bad idea to put a poor quality candidate in a tight election. So you don't want to put them in a marginal constituency. This is why I think you would get a better class of MP if we had proportional representation as well, because you really need to fight for every vote. With first past the post, you don't. I mean, Labour's strategy, for example, if we look at their Brexit position, which is obviously I did a video on that yesterday, but nonetheless, their rhetoric. Has it actually now started raining? Oh my god! It doesn't look too cloudy. It should be a quick one. So the Labour's Brexit rhetoric is obviously putting off a lot of very pro-EU Labour supporters, and that could cost them votes. Like I try and argue, it shouldn't do. People need to focus on what the difference is between a Labour government and a Conservative government in terms of Brexit, but people do vote against their own interests, and it's not just Tory voters that vote against their own interests. Other voters do as well. We think about people who voted Leave didn't understand things, they didn't know what they were talking about, as if the people who voted Remain were all wise in the ways of the EU and understood it all. No, there were plenty of people who voted Remain that didn't understand the issues either. They just they just knew or believed the experts without really knowing that we shouldn't have left the EU. So there are plenty of ignorant people on the Remain or Rejoin side as well, who will absolutely vote against their own interests. But Labour, because of first past the post, and people sometimes will say, are Labour taking my vote for granted? And to a certain extent, yeah. They're taking it for granted on the basis that where a lot of people of that sort of view live, Labour have large majorities. Labour to get an MP in a constituency, you only need to have one more vote than the nearest candidate. One vote's all you need. The rest of them, if you have a majority of 20,000, nice and comfortable for the winning candidate, worthless to the party, that's like 19,999 votes that are completely wasted. They can afford to lose some votes in those areas. This weather's taking the piss now. But anyway, let's who paid for Brexit? Well, there's a lot in there. You would think the Kremlin paid for a certain amount of it. There was a lot of international money, but ultimately So I mean, effectively, we could just say the billionaires, wouldn't we? The billionaire media moguls, the billionaire Tory donors, the billionaires in other countries as well, particularly Russia, the Russian government. It was in no one's interest in this country. It was in the interest of people who have no particular ties to this country. People who don't even reside in this country largely is where a lot of the money came from. But anyway, so let's we've got new comments about MPs again. Realise that the Lib Dems are starting from a much lower base, but why do Labour never seem to get huge swings in their favour? Welcome as their 12% swing was. Really, because most people don't change their minds. That's what I mean when I say there's tens of millions of people who vote in a general election, but it comes down to the voting behaviour of about 300,000 people. Most people do not change their voting behaviour because they're sure they're right. And some of them may be, I suppose, but they're sure they're right. They don't change that voting behaviour. So many comments, sorry. And it's... So, I mean, a 12% swing is really large. You know, the similar sort of drop for the Conservatives was really large. Oh my goodness. I'm going to have to move the microphone closer again, aren't I? So that's in the way. Oh, but it's, yeah, most people don't change. And you're not going to get most people to change. So Labour's job is to get a small number of people to change how they vote, and it triggers, like 2019 for example, Boris Johnson won an 80-seat majority. It's now a 68-seat majority. It's coming down, but he won an 80-seat majority. He got about 250,000 more votes than Theresa May did in 2017. 2017 Theresa May had a majority, not a big one, and she lost it. So the Conservatives didn't have a majority in 2019. Boris Johnson went to the polls. He won an extra 250,000 votes in a population where you've got 30 odd million people voting, 250,000, and all of a sudden it went from not a minority government to massive majority. 80-seat majority is huge for anyone. You know, and that's the difference. It's just a few people changing the way they vote. Maybe some people not voting at all. It has to be said, there were Labour just lost a lot of votes as well. But there you go. Someone ordered the end of the world. It just sounds like it. It's a very light shower, but it just sounds like, you know, the apocalypse on this conservatory roof. And it hasn't. That is absolutely insane. It's just waited for now. You say it's nice blue skies here in London. It is here. There's blue sky. It's just pissing. It's just raining on this roof. I can't even see. I can see a little bit of rain outside. When it started, I couldn't even see the rain outside. But anyway, the Lib Dems show him the door gimmick was criticised on Twitter and the press, but created quite a lot of publicity and images to be shared, etc. As did the burst, the bubble balloon and brick wall. Yes, that's exactly what it is. Parcel wrote exactly what it's about. It's the Nigel Farage situation, isn't it? Why did Nigel Farage get all the media time that he did on the BBC and other channels and programmes when he was an unknown politician? He was a UKIP politician, for goodness sake. How did he start getting thrust on the telly, being put on Newsnight and Question Time and all the rest of it? Not so much Newsnight, I meant Question Time. And it was because of his gimmicks. The gimmicks do the work. That's what you need to do. You need to be engaging. You know, this is what Keir Starmer needs to do now in PMQs more. You know, he's done his work on Boris Johnson. He's leaving. He's finished. He's dead. He's just limping on. He doesn't know he's dead yet, politically speaking, of course. So Starmer doesn't have to put more pressure on Boris Johnson anymore. He needs to remind people that he's still about and he's still a reprehensible rogue, but he needs to now in PMQ shift into more engagement. He needs to be coming out with things, and he has done in the last couple of weeks, I suppose, but he needs to be coming out with more things that if you can imagine clipping it and it'd get shared on social media. You know, it just needs to create moments in PMQs now that will be widely shared. So that's the focus. The focus is now engagement. It's very much like a social media strategy. You know, on the channel, what I have to focus on is engagement. You know, at any time there might be things I want to talk about, and I think to myself, but the vast majority of my videos, I have to think to myself, it's the sort of thing that people want to share with others. That's the editorial decision that has to be made. There are occasionally videos I produce and I know, and I will struggle to make them engaging enough, and they won't get shared as much, but they're important messages that I want to get out there, and I sacrifice the view. I know that it won't get that many views, but it'll get a lot more views than if I just did all of those videos all of the time. You know, so you have to be engaging 90% of the time, and then the 10%, the rest of the time, you can sneak your messages out. And Labour should do the same thing. They should really learn from people who are trying to explain to them how to reach people. They are actually a little bit at the moment. There might be some news in the not too distant future on that, actually. Graham Hughes, who many of you will know, has been doing some sterling work in trying to persuade Labour to sort out a proper social media strategy. And he may be getting results. But anyway, I think the rain may have stopped now. But I can't wait till it starts hailstone. Oh no, you don't want a hailstone in here. Is that the way? The phrase, it's grim up north, why high prices are so much cheaper up there? They are much cheaper up here. Do you know what? In the news today, right? So the latest is that Boris Johnson tried to get a tree house for his son, Wilf, built on the grounds of Chequers, which, I mean, he wasn't allowed to, but it was on security grounds. But quite frankly, it's not his pissing garden. It's not his house. It's the grace and favour house for the Prime Minister when he's no longer Prime Minister. It's not his, it's the state's. He's got no business trying to build a tree house on it. But here's the thing, right? Two things about it. First of all, he wasn't going to pay for it himself. Brownlow again, the guy who paid for his flat redecoration, was going to fund it. And the second thing is, £150,000 for a tree house? What the? Is it going to have machine gun turrets on it or something? But how do you spend 150 grand on a tree house? I'm going to have to look up now places that sell them. I want to know what a 150 grand tree house is like for a 4-year-old pissing boy, because, but 150,000 up here, that would get you a a nice 3-bedroom semi-detached house with off-road parking, nice drive, probably get a few cars on it. You'd get something quite nice up here. And I'm in the North Midlands. You go to the north of England and you will get a very nice house. You could try going to as far as Middlesbrough. 'Cause I keep citing Middlesbrough purely because it is the cheapest place in England to get housing. So, you know, you go properly up north. In Scotland, there'll be places where you can get something a bit special for 150 grand as well. A tree house. Bulletproof double glazing. Well, maybe. Or bespoke wallpaper. I cannot, I'm going to have to look it up. I cannot conceive of a tree house costing 150 grand. The studio that I have, which you obviously can't see, but, you know, it's a nice studio. That's a sort of, that cost me 15 grand. He's going to spend 10 times as much as I spent on my garden studio on a pissing tree. Well, he wasn't going to spend it. He was going to get a Tory donor to spend it. But yeah, absolutely immense. The treehouse was to cost twice as much as my house up north. It was quite spectacular. But anyway, again, it's not the real world, is it? It's not the real world this person lives in. You know, if you look at the various stages of delusion to him, first of all, he wants to build a tree house on property that's not his. Imagine like renting a cottage and then expecting and ordering a shed to put, I want a shed here, as if it's your property. It's like, that would be ridiculous. And so he like thinks of it as his. So the fact that he wanted a tree house there meant he thought of it as his. Not just that he was going to be there a long time. Doesn't matter how long he thinks he's going to be there. He might think he's going to be Prime Minister another 10 years. Doesn't matter. It's still not his. You know, he wants to build something on. So then the second stage, £150,000. It wasn't like a tree house as you'd normally think of it, of like, oh, father and son bonding thing, where he was going to help Wilf build this tree house, you know, as some project. Because that's what a tree house is, really, isn't it? It's something that the father does for the son or helps with, and it's how you show them how to do some basic things. Obviously, Will's probably a bit young, but it's something that the father does. He wasn't going to do anything. It wasn't a father-son bonding thing. So what was the tree house for then? It was to stick Wilf out the way so he didn't have to bother with him. Oh, Wilf's bothering me an awful lot. Where can we put him? Well, put him in the garden. Now he'll just run back. We need to put him up a tree. You can't just put him up a tree. What if I got him a tree house? All right, then see if you can get him a tree house. So he's comfortable while he's being shunned by his father. And then the next stage is he won't even pay for it himself. Won't even pay for it himself. A multimillionaire who, when he retires as Prime Minister, is going to be... No, don't imagine him going to prison. He's going to be raking it in. Raking it in. He's going to get someone to... He won't write the book himself. He's too lazy. He'll get someone to ghostwrite his memoirs, which will be the biggest act of fiction since Lord of the Rings. He will... he'll be on the speech circuit again, charging mega bucks. Go to America. He'll be absolutely raking it in. He's going to be fantastically wealthy. You know, and he's too tight to pay for the tree house that he wants so that he can get rid of his son for a few hours a day. But anyway, that's my little rant over about a pissing tree house. In Edinburgh, 150 grand might get you a tree house, or is it a bit expensive there? I wasn't necessarily thinking of cities in Scotland when I was thinking of, you might be able to, I was thinking of more sort of normal sort of towns. But anyway, but certainly where I am, £150,000 would get you a nice semi-detached house. 3 bedrooms, a decent one as well. I mean, you could get a not very decent one for about 100,000. It wouldn't be a particularly good one. Probably 2 bedrooms as well. Maybe it comes with a moat and a duck house. Oh yeah, well, it'd have to come with a moat because again, if the purpose of this tree house is so we can get rid of his son, so you don't have to bother with him, go and play in the tree house, son. Don't come down. So yeah, of course you're going to have a moat. It's probably, never mind ducks. It'll have crocodiles in it to make sure that Wilf can't bother his father in the afternoon. LBC reporting Boris wanted it to be bulletproof. Oh, is that actually true? He wanted it to be bulletproof. Why? Why? So, okay. So, an armed assailant is going to break into the grounds of Chequers, right? For which there is security, remember, because the Prime Minister is there, is present. And they think that this gunman is going to try and shoot a small boy in a treehouse. Not the Prime Minister on the lawn. Because at the end of the day, a normal treehouse is reasonable cover against a sniper. I'm not saying it's brilliant, but it's reasonable cover. It makes the job tricky for a sniper. Should a sniper ever be contracted to take out a 4-year-old boy? Would the sniper be not more likely to be contracted to take out the Prime Minister? What? No, we're not going to go on about this pissing treehouse all the time. Let's go on to some more sensible questions. Will ex-Prime Minister Boris Johnson be happy spending the rest of his life being announced as ex-Prime Minister? I strongly suspect not. Obviously, he would want to leave at a time of his choosing. He doesn't want to be forced out of office. It's embarrassing. At the moment, he's not going to be a particularly long-lived Prime Minister. He's still been in office less time than Theresa May. I'm going to have to look up, because it might get close. I'm going to have to look up how long Theresa May was in office before being removed. It will have been, it must be quite close. Maybe he's about to overtake her or something. Actually, oh no, has he exceeded? No, hang on. No, he probably has exceeded her time in office now. But I mean, that's not a very high bar. But there we go. Oh, hi, Michael. Very willing to take Boris Johnson and his bastard to court. I have no idea what they would take. However, the charges: criminal negligence, gross negligence, manslaughter, etc. Like I say, it would be, I think, highly tricky. We don't know in the future. Who knows what gets turned up? For it to be worth, and it is wrong that someone in government will largely get away with any criminal acts they may have committed, like serious criminal acts we're talking about here. But it can often look political. Like if Boris Johnson, there were various criminal investigations that should have opened up into not only Boris Johnson but others over, for example, the Brexit referendum, because his campaign group was found to have broken electoral law. So there should have been a criminal investigation, because if the campaign broke the law, that it doesn't mean it's definitely the case, but it suggests that there's a good chance that certain individuals broke criminal law. But the investigation never went ahead. Why not? Because the Conservatives threatened the National Crime Agency with funding cuts. So yeah, it's so if Labour came in and removed the threat of those funding cuts and said you should probably carry out some of these investigations, it would look political. So he's unless something massive turns up, like unless Keir Starmer finds a body under the basement of Downing Street or something, I strongly suspect. Was May in post 2016, 2000? Yeah, David Cameron stepped down after the Brexit referendum, so I am thinking that Boris Johnson now has overtaken Theresa May, because she was forced to resign in May 2019, wasn't she? So he will have overtaken her now, I suspect. But again, it's still a very short time in office. If you sort of go back, I think you'd have to go back to Callaghan of Labour in the late 70s to find a Prime Minister who lasted less time. But there you go. As long as Johnson gets sacked, that's the best humiliation we'll get. Yeah, I'm not after revenge or anything. I just want it to stop. I mean, it can aggrieve you that someone who's done the deliberate damage that he has, and others in his cabinet, it's not just him, will get away with it. Unfortunately, I don't see a credible way that he won't get away with it, and I'm not going to waste my energy on demanding justice as such. We won't get it. Well, we may get it. I don't want to rule it out completely. Who knows? But it's not what I'm focusing on. What I'm focusing on is trying to reduce the amount of damage, and it does worry me, because there is an importance in making sure that people in positions of power do suffer legal consequences. Because if they don't suffer the consequences, what is to stop a future government doing the same thing? You know, but the focus has to be on repairing the damage, and it will be unfortunate that whoever has to repair the damage will get no credit for it. You know, I was saying to someone earlier, you know, when people were saying, let's say there were a general election this year, all that would happen is Labour would be left with the mess, and they'll get attacked for it by the Tory media and everything like that. And yeah, but in my view, if you look at it historically, the Conservatives are never, they have this myth that they're good with the economy. They're never good with the economy. They're certainly not good with public services. So you could look at it like this. Whenever Labour come into power, it is always to deal with the mess that the Conservatives have left. Always. And then they eventually lose power, usually quite quickly. At the last occasion, it wasn't actually that quick. And then the Tories come in and wreck it all again. And then eventually people get sick of all the damage. The people who voted them there get sick of all the damage, let Labour back in to clear it. It's almost like Labour exist, as far as the electorate are concerned, to clear up the Tory mess when they've gone a bit too far. It's like people, I know it's not the case. I know this isn't true, because the Tories don't get anywhere near 50% of the vote. But it's almost like, if you look at the results, the electorate It's like they sort of want a Conservative government, but they know they can't afford it for too long. Oh, let Labour in, clean up the place, and then back in. The black mark against Johnson's name in the history books is the best revenge we like to get. Yeah, again, it's, as I say, I'm not into revenge, but it's history will always find out these people, always. Once the people who were allied with him are no longer in positions of influence, history is free to give an honest account of things. But they don't care about that, even if they think it'll happen. And Boris Johnson, as I say, is highly delusional, so he won't. He thinks he'll be recorded as one of history's greatest heroes, like Donald Trump. You know, Donald Trump thinks he was the most put upon president in history, didn't he? But also the most loved. Realistically, when will a general election be called? I think, again, there's any number of times when it could, because it's all politics is highly volatile right now. January 2025 remains my best guess, because there's two things that can trigger a general election, realistically. First of all, the Conservatives have got a massive majority, so in theory they get to decide when the next general election is. They're not going to go to the polls when they are likely to lose. And I know some people say there's potential in going to the polls quickly, Labour winning it with a minority government, because if they leave it too long, it might be that Labour could get a much stronger minority, maybe even sneak into majority territory. So go for it now when Labour aren't quite ready, the Lib Dems aren't quite ready, and then and dump on their door the issue of the Scottish independence referendum, leave them all the shit to deal with, attack them daily in the press, and then at the next election, which might not even be after 5 years, because Labour may struggle on as a minority government, the Tories come straight back in, blame Labour for all the shit that's actually still their fault that Labour didn't clear up yet, and away you go. And you could look at that and you could see some tactical benefit to it. But the Conservatives are ideologically driven. So I don't think they will do that. They intend to win the next election. So that means you do not go to the polls early unless you are confident you're going to win. Now, that could be earlier. It could be next year. They could get rid of Boris Johnson this year. They could get a replacement. The replacement may suddenly see a bounce back in the polls. The replacement may end up being quite popular for a while. Then they'll go, right, trigger a general election, like Theresa May did in 2017. At that point, we will find out if they end up being literally like Theresa May and run a very bad campaign, and this time Labour just about, because they almost got there in 2017. It was not impossible for Labour. They just fell a little bit short. So maybe this time they won't. But so that's another possibility. The other possibility is that Boris Johnson, that moves are made to get rid of Boris Johnson, and he pushes the nuclear button as a last desperate act. Because in Boris Johnson's head, he's going to win the next election. I'm fairly convinced of that, 95% convinced that in his head, he thinks he's going to win the next election. Just like those Tories thought they were going to win Tiverton and Honiton. In his head, he thinks he's going to win the next election. So as far as he's concerned, the problem will be that the lack of confidence that Tory MPs have him, not the public, Tory MPs. So he'll convince them by, because you might look at it as he'll trigger the general election as a way to stick two fingers up at the Tory party trying to get rid of him. No, he won't. He'll do it because he thinks he can win them back by proving he can win an election. But as I say, he's delusional. But he'll have enough allies who'll vote for it. And remember, the opposition will vote for it. Labour will vote for it. The Lib Dems will vote for it. The SNP will vote for it. Opposition MPs will vote for it. So actually Johnson only needs about 50 or so of his own MPs to vote for it, and he'll get more than that. But anyway. Do I think interest rate rises will ramp up once Labour hopefully get in? The Bank of England's independent. It sets interest rates independent of the government. It's done that since Labour last came to power. The current government, although there's been questions about whether they take control again, they're not interested in doing that. So the rates will have nothing to do with who's in government. The rates will be set according to inflation. Interest rates rise as a typical knee-jerk reaction. I'm not saying it's a bad one. Knee-jerk sometimes has negative connotations, but it's a typical reaction to try and keep a lid on inflation. So interest rates will keep rising while inflation remains far too high, just like in America. So it'll have nothing to. So obviously they're less likely to rise under Labour technically because they should start to cool inflation down. By, for example, reducing our trade barriers with the EU. But we are still going to have an inflation problem for some time, even if Labour got in this year. The last one on the treehouse, I think I ranted enough about it, is Johnson wanting to spend £150,000 on a treehouse. Is it a scandal or does it not matter or won't cut through? It won't, it's just another one on the pile, isn't it? It won't cut through, I think, because of a few things. First of all, it was never done. I think there's enough scandal. The scandals are mostly about what he's done, not what about he wanted to do. It's a little bit like the jobs for Carrie. That should be a serious scandal, but it's not really going to have much cut through to the public because it never happened. If it had have happened, that could be a different matter. Like the Jennifer Arcuri scandal is more of a scandal because he actually chucked that money at her. Public money. Just because she shagged him. I would love to see Johnson lose his seat. I mean, that is very much on the cards. I mean, that is on the cards. If the Tories win fewer than 100 seats in the general election, will they jump on the proportional representation bandwagon? It's not going to happen there. Yeah, they won't lose that much. They will get more than 200 seats. The worst case scenario for the Conservatives is that they get a similar drubbing that Labour got in 2019, and even then it won't be as bad. And the reason why I say that is Labour cannot encroach as strongly into Conservative territory. There are some constituencies that can go between Labour and the Conservatives. Of course they are. That's why we split between Labour and Conservative governments. But most Tory seats can only realistically be challenged by the Liberal Democrats. And the Liberal Democrats are not a large enough party to be able to target enough seats. So the Liberal Democrats realistically have only got the funds to manage a target list of 20 to 30. The more they try and target, the thinner they'll spread themselves. So they need to be very careful. And if they don't target them, they're very unlikely to win them. It is possible. Obviously, you can't discount a very strong local campaign and tactical voting, and people just being generally sick of the Tories could win them a few extra ones as well. But by and large, they'll flip the ones they target, and not even all of those. You can't get a coconut every time. Oh, it's interesting. Where have you got this from? Has anyone seen Jeff Taylor's Northern Ireland Protocol diatribe? I haven't, no. It says the Tories seem to have quietly pulled the Northern Ireland Protocol bill. I've not heard that. And I think I would have heard it if they had. I don't know what anyone would be basing that on. The Northern Ireland Protocol bill, what's that based on that they've quietly pulled it? I've certainly not seen any statements to that effect. Tories will never go for PR as they would never win easily, and when they did, they'd be restrained by coalition. Well, this is exactly it. The thing is, the Conservative Party exists for the interests of the very wealthy and privileged, and they will never form a large enough group in a proportionally representative parliament. Now, I'm not going to say you couldn't get any crap governments with PR, because of course you can. There are crap governments in Europe right now. There have been crap governments in Europe in the past. There have even been crap right-wing law-breaking governments in the past. You know, Berlusconi's Italy, Chirac's France at various times. But it massively reduces the chances of it. Obviously, with Chirac, of course, it was a slightly different thing. That was a presidency, not so much the parliament. But the Tories cannot achieve, like at the moment, this is wet dream territory for the Tories. When they talked about a new golden age, it's the golden age for them. And proportional representation would bring it crashing down. So for me, that is the number one priority. I am undecided as to whether it needs to be a manifesto promise, because I do not know what the likely impact on the electoral strategy would be. What I do want to know is, and there's a lot of questioning about this, is because first of all, people will say Starmer is resisting it, and technically he is. It's not Starmer resisting it as such, though, because he is a supporter of proportional representation. It's the advice he's getting, and what I want to know is the advice good? Is it robust? Because the worst case scenario is that proportional representation would give a big boost in support to Labour. The problem is a lot of people will just say things like, oh yeah, but there'll be and it's true, there'll be loads of Lib Dem voters and Green voters who will vote Labour if they promise to deliver proportional representation, to get it over the line, to get it done. The thing is, though, would they and where are they? Because if they're not in Labour's target seats, it doesn't matter. Like I said, Labour, in a first past the post system, you cannot base a strategy on improving your vote share in a seat you're already going to win. Even if it's tight, you can afford to win seats by a tight margin. In fact, you do. When I said Boris Johnson only won about 250,000 votes more than Theresa May, you know, the way he won is by better targeting where their votes were. So he won a lot of seats by a small margin, which is why the Conservatives are in such trouble now, because there's a lot of seats where the margin is very small and it can easily be overturned by having, for example, a toxic leader. This is why Boris Johnson's position is so tenuous, because there's a lot of Tory MPs who did not win their seats by a big margin, because that was the strategy and it worked. Labour need to do the same thing. They can afford to lose votes where they're strong, and you know, some people say, oh, they're pissing off their traditional support. They can afford to lose some traditional support where they're strong, if it means they can increase their support where they're on the cusp, where it's borderline. But they have to get it right. But anyway, do I believe taxes should be shifted from earnings to accumulated wealth, property and land? There are some Lib Dems moves in this direction. The tax burden has to be shifted more towards those who can afford it. I accept it can be a tricky issue, not just contentious, I don't care about that as much, but it can be a tricky issue where it involves land and property. But at the same time, we also can't expect people who have a lot of wealth to hide behind the fact that it's not in liquid form, as to coin a phrase. But at the same time, I would start off with the low-hanging fruit of earnings. There are people who make lots of earnings who can afford to pay more tax. You know, start off with the people. A wealth tax, I think, will ultimately need to be part of the solution. And Labour also have a general policy of being interested in a wealth tax. It never raises as much as people claim, by the way. When you see claims, oh, it'll raise this much money, it never raises as much as you think it will, because at the end of the day, the calculations, even when they're honestly done and competently done, they're based on wealth that's freely declared, and the reason the people who have it can declare it is because they know it's not been taxed. Whereas all of a sudden, if you decide you're going to tax it, they'll hide it. The very wealthy people are very adept at hiding their taxable earnings and wealth. So all of a sudden, if you make more of their wealth taxable, they will make more of it hidden. So it will never raise as much as people think, but it will need to be part of the solution. But I would start off with a more sensible distribution of taxes on earnings. It can't be said enough, there's a lot of people doing that. You know, they're making a lot of money. Executives on hundreds of thousands of pounds a year, paying relatively little tax on it. And you don't need to raise it by that much either. You don't need to, like, I mean, I'm not in favour of, for example, taxing anyone more than half of their earnings. I'm quite happy that people should always keep at least half their earnings, no matter how much they earn, as a philosophical attitude there. But you know, you just have to increase it by a few percent sometimes, and it makes a huge difference. But anyway, to make PR possible, won't we need to run it past the members? If you mean in Labour, Labour members are going to vote for it. They voted for it last year at the party conference. It was the unions that sunk it. But since then, at least 2 unions that I know that sunk it last year have had their own motions brought up in their own conferences, and now their official position is to support it. So in the Labour Party conference this late summer, early autumn, I can't remember, it's on the cusp, isn't it? It's towards the end of September. Can't remember exactly where it falls in the seasons, but it doesn't matter. In September, Labour Party conference, the conference is going to vote in favour of the party adopting proportional representation. So the only barrier to Labour formally adopting it as policy is not Starmer. It's too simplistic to say Starmer. It is Keir Starmer believing that it would be an electorally sound move. That's what needs to happen. He needs to be persuaded that it's a sensible move. And I'll tell you where the issue is. There was another article as well, so Andy Burnham's piped up again about it. My issue with it, Unite, yes, I can't remember who the other union were, maybe Unison, but I think there was it may be Unison as well, but I think there was another smaller union that has. But either way, at conference this year, it's going to pass. It's going to pass, that is certain. You'd bet your house on it, right? So yeah, the problem was, whenever I see an article by someone arguing for why Labour should adopt proportional representation, it always focuses on the benefits of proportional representation. It never seems to tackle the issue of whether it will help or hinder Labour win the next election. Because if Labour adopt it, and as a result of it they lose the next election, do we get proportional representation? No, we get 5 more years of Tory rule. So you have to tackle that issue. Put it this way, if Keir Starmer did not believe, if he thought it was either neutral or a bonus for Labour from a point of view of winning the next election, he would have already adopted it. He wouldn't, well actually no, he would wait for the conference to formally vote for it, because then he could say he's listening to the party, right? But he would adopt it, and he would adopt it this year if he was convinced that it was not a vote loser in those target areas. There's no doubt about it, because even as Labour leader, he's talked about the benefits of it. You know, he's obviously been a bit cautious as he is, but he is a supporter of it. But he's a bigger supporter of Labour winning the election. So the argument has to be not the benefits of proportional representation. The argument has to be, will it win Labour the next election, or help? Will it be a contributing factor towards them winning, as opposed to a net drag on their ability to win? That's the key question. That's what people need to ask. Anyone who writes an article talking about the benefits of proportional representation, if they're just trying to do it for the general public, fine, great. If they're trying to do it as an argument for Labour adopting it, totally worthless argument. But anyway. There are many people, especially in farming areas, that have land and property but do not make much and struggle to stay afloat. Taxing earnings is fairer. Taxing earnings is always fairer. And as I say, that would be the first port of call. But when we talk about a wealth tax, we're not talking about taxing people who are struggling to get by. There are people with ridiculous amounts of wealth, billions in wealth. people who have billions, even if they've got relatively low earnings, which is very unlikely, are not poor. Oh, GMB, you just mentioned there. That may be the one I was thinking of. But anyway. According to opinion polls, a considerable majority is in favour of PR vote and other reforms. Yes, but here, well, a majority is anyway. I don't know. We can argue about the definition of a considerable majority. But the issue is not whether the majority of people are in favour of it. Because first of all, a poll like that takes no account of voters, and it certainly takes no account of voters in target seats. There are lots of things the public were in favour of. A majority of the public, when it came down to it, were in favour of remaining in the EU after the mess. If we'd have had a second referendum, we would have voted to remain. It's not even speculation, even the Brexiteers knew that. Jacob Rees-Mogg was asked, why don't you support a second referendum to stop the deadlock? And he came out as clear as you like on being recorded for telly, and he said, because the result will be overturned. You know, it doesn't matter what the majority want. What matters is what the key voters want. That's what matters. And the key voters in 2019 did not want to stop Brexit. Not enough. Even the ones who, if you gave them that choice, would have voted to remain, they didn't want it enough to actually vote to make it happen. So yeah, this is the problem when people latch onto opinion polls, because it can be toxic in a way as well. Because what you'll do is you'll look at Labour, let's say Labour's position, you look at the Labour leadership and you go, why don't they adopt this? There's a clear majority in favour of it. And you start to think that the Labour leadership isn't up to it, because why are they making this decision? And it's because it doesn't matter what the majority want. It's not the majority that are going to put them in government. It's that few 100,000 voters in like 100 seats that flip between one party and another. That's who's going to decide it. Why did the AV referendum fail? Well, I'm sure there's some political scientists could write a large paper on it, and they probably have done, but I would put it down to effectively three things. First of all, obviously the Tories are very good at running campaigns, dishonest campaigns, but they're very sharp at it. Secondly, the Liberal Democrats who spearheaded the campaign for it were bog useless. Thirdly, Labour were in complete mess and they didn't do anything. They were of no use at all in that argument. They didn't really want it, so they didn't come in support of it either. So basically, the three parties that had a stake in it, a big stake in it, didn't. Well, the Tories fought the campaign well, the Liberal Democrats didn't, and Labour were just in a heap. You know, they'd only just lost the election at this point. They were still going through some serious turmoil. Strategic thinking was not their strong point. So it was a right mess, absolute mess. And I want proportional representation anyway. I would take AV as being better. It's a little bit like, you know, with Brexit, and some people saying, well, what if we had a form of Brexit that meant remaining in the single market? That would be better. Yes, it would be better. It's not as good as full membership. I have the same sort of attitude with AV. And my other issue with it, it's a little bit like, you know, a form of Brexit that means being in the single market still. It's like, it makes, if you adopt the alternative vote, it's much less likely you'll actually move towards proportional representation, because people aren't going to keep chopping and changing the electoral system. So if we changed it for one thing, it's sort of going to be that for a while. And AV for me, in fact, Pastor Rose saying the AV referendum was finished off by lack of Labour support. Yeah, I mean, Labour were in a massive mess over it. Huge mess. I mean, you think from Labour's point of view, this was the situation, right? This will have to be the last point, I think. They just lost the general election, so they were in a mess. They were caught between wanting to win the next election, but trying to distance themselves from the last Labour government, as if that, which was a madness. It was absolutely ridiculous. They should have been talking up Labour's achievements, but they had to distance themselves. So they were in a mess. They were having a crisis of conscience. The second thing is they weren't very happy with the Lib Dems for forming a coalition with the Tories. So there was a lot of people in Labour didn't want Labour to back the Lib Dems as such, even though it meant backing the Tories by definition. This is madness. But there were all sorts of chaos going on in Labour at the time. Whereas, you know, if there were a future one, Labour would be behind it, because the position's more settled, especially if it was for proportional representation. It's really what's needed. Imagine where we'd be now if Tony Blair would introduce PR. Exactly. That for me, never mind several other things, that for me was the greatest failure. You know, it's all right him whining about a lot of the work that's been undone by these conservative Brexiteer nutters. They could not have had that power if he had have been willing to sacrifice his own for proportional representation. And I don't begin to know exactly why Tony Blair wouldn't get behind it, but I strongly suspect it's because the problem with proportional representation is if you've just won a decent sized majority with first past the post, you know you're losing it with PR. Tony Blair knew that the second he introduced proportional representation, the very next election, yes, he'd still be Prime Minister, but he'd be sharing power. And he didn't want to do that. I mean, that's not me saying it as fact, that is my speculation, but that is what I would imagine is the reason. But it was so short-sighted, unbelievable. That's what I particularly hate. But anyway, there it is. We'll leave it there. Thanks for coming on, everyone. Hopefully it won't rain next week, but we will see. Have a good evening, everyone, and until next time, I'll see you later.